I'd like to begin by correcting an omission from last week. Skylanders was also released in 2011, and although it may not be as popular today as it was back then due to Activision driving it into the ground, it started a new trend. That of a game tied to a line of physical toys. In a way, you could consider it as a continuation of Guitar Hero, that at this point was a dead game in a dead genre, since the model of selling a plastic add-on for a digital game was the same here. But the plastic add-ons themselves had value on their own, as toys, as collectibles maybe, not just NFC-equipped add-ons that enable content in-game. And not only did it become a gigantic billion-dollar franchise, but it gave other companies the idea of doing the same, and very soon they would. But let's kick off 2012 properly, the year when world governments tried to backstab the people in the name of giant media companies with initiatives like ACTA and SOPA. When the Curiosity rover landed on Mars by being lowered down from a rocket-powered crane, something that you could rebuild in the Kerbal Space Program. When Microsoft forgot it was making software for PCs and tried to turn your desktop into a tablet with Windows 10. When a man jumped off a balloon at the edge of space, broke the sound barrier on his way down, and lived to become the legend that Felix Baumgartner is today. When Marvel's Avengers made more money than anything not called GTA and sent every movie studio into a craze to create their own cinematic universe with disastrous consequences. But most of all, this was the year when internet trends began to leak into the real world. No longer would a worthless meme remain on the web where it belonged. It would bleed into society, and especially into the shriveling mainstream media. You know, the one that, when it wasn't inviting some expert that touted December 2012 as the end of the world, was trying to do the Gangnam Style dance, because that's what the kids were doing. And speaking of the web, the word slacktivism really came to the forefront this year thanks to the Kony 2012 campaign, an initially earnest attempt to raise awareness of the existence of a true monster, which quickly morphed into a disaster. The campaign received a lot of criticism for its manipulative methods. Most of its supporters were just looking for something to be smug about championing that week and then forgot about it, and the person that initiated it went insane for a bit. This within just a span of a few weeks. And this would become the norm. Something happens, millions of people change their avatars, throw hashtags around, grandstand on Twitter, never actually try to help. Never actually try to do something, and 2 days later they'd forget about it. Some would call this virtue signaling, some would call it slacktivism, some would call it the only thing you'd find today on social media, to the point where some people equate using hashtags as feeding the poor ironically, which is still a good thing because it still feeds the poor, only they're not doing that. They're taking selfies of them giving a box that's labeled food to a homeless person, an empty box, that they then take away and give to a different homeless person to pose for another selfie. Moving back to video games, we entered a new console generation, well, sort of. Hardware-wise, Nintendo was a generation behind the others, so with the Wii U it was mostly playing catch-up, but it was doing it in the form of what was still one of the hottest new gadgets, a tablet, but it would be one of Nintendo's worst-selling consoles, mostly because they called it the Wii U, and they mostly showed the tablet, which was not the console itself. It was only a screen and a controller for it. Something that would enable a second screen experience, which was a thing that was getting started back then and would quickly die out. So when people went to buy it, they were upset that they were being forced to buy the console again just for the tablet. Bear in mind, the Wii was successful with people that would not really be aware that this was a different machine altogether. This, combined with Nintendo announcing the console out of the blue, with little communication to many developers, would be its undoing. Even the ones that embraced it from the get-go, like Ubisoft, would soon regret it and pull out. The studio even released a game called Zombie U for the platform, which was coincidentally almost the same name as one of Ubisoft's first games from many decades ago. And in the zombie craze of 2012, it would be the least interesting one. Telltale hit it out of the park with The Walking Dead, a diluted adventure game with a heavy focus on story, characters, and choices that made you feel like everything you were doing was bringing more misery to those trying to live through a zombie apocalypse. It was a massive success. Sadly, instead of using it as a springboard for the next big thing, Telltale would just reuse the formula and the technology in the exact same form with ever diminishing returns. But it still doesn't take away from the impact that The Walking Dead Season 1 had. And then there was a mod for a very niche military simulator called Arma 2, a mod made by a man named Dean Rocket Hall, a mod named DayZ, combining the menace of zombies with the menace of other people controlled by actual human players in a realistic setting where you had only one life with survival elements that had you manage your food and your water and other things, all powered by a military simulator engine. It just blew up in popularity, gaining over 1 million players in only 3 months. Many would buy Arma 2 and its expansion only to play DayZ, and everyone would try to copy it, with disastrous consequences like The War Z, a game so horrible that it would change its name to dodge criticism and outright try to ban videos criticizing it. DayZ would be so successful that Bohemia Interactive announced it was turning it into its own game running on the Arma 3 engine. By the time this series of shows ends, the game will still have not been completed, though it will have been released. The video games industry had 3 major occupations in 2012: chasing trends, making sequels, and resurrecting old things. Arkane Studios succeeded at creating the second of its planned trilogy of Looking Glass spiritual sequels with Dishonored, a stealth game inspired by Thief that gave you the power of an eldritch god to abuse for fun and profit, that is, profit from the misery of people living in a world hurtling towards doom with each life you take. Double Dragon came back with a campy Double Dragon Neon by Way Forward Technologies, a fun and really good comeback/parody of the originals. Blizzard finally gave us Diablo 3 after more than a decade of waiting, and it did so with all the limitations you would expect from a company that put monetization before design. The game was only playable online, it featured no support for modifications, though it did feature a real money auction house that profited off gold farmers and item sellers that had been around in the MMO genre for ages. And it made sure that there wasn't such a thing as a skill build anymore. Everything was item based, so that people would have more reason to visit that auction house. And when one of the original creators of Diablo said that his old team would have probably done something a bit different, the then director of Diablo 3 really didn't have nice words for him in public. Spec Ops: The Line revived the old Spec Ops franchise that was basically forgotten at this point, in a twisted and subversive anti-war, anti-glorification of violence, anti-hero worship masterpiece that had a multiplayer mode tacked onto it by 2K Games because it didn't think that anybody would want to play such a game. This coming from a company that had already expressed the belief that strategy games were not contemporary, which is why it was remaking XCOM as a shooter, until people pointed out that they didn't like that, which is why they then announced and released XCOM as a strategy game. A really simplified and less creative one than the original, but a good base to one day build something great upon. Tribes Ascend attempted to revive the Tribes formula and succeeded for a while, though it did so with a very limited scope, Sadly, Hi-Rez would soon develop a very popular MOBA and would give up on Tribes for a few years, managing to burn up a lot of goodwill in the process. Valve and Hidden Path brought back Counter-Strike in the form of Global Offensive, a game that still manages to be wildly successful, even more so than its predecessor, owing mostly to there not being a lot of good competitive multiplayer first-person shooters out there anymore. id Software re-released Doom 3, this time with a flashlight taped to the weapons and with support for something completely new. Some kid called Palmer from Long Beach cobbled together in his parents' garage a virtual reality device. You could strap it to your head and you'd see the game as if you were actually there, and it would move with you, letting you experience a virtual world in a new way. And that's what Doom 3 brought. And that kid's idea, the Rift as he called it, that would be making some waves really soon. Meanwhile, Electronic Arts was forcing out a syndicate first-person shooter instead of a strategy game based entirely on the immense positive reaction generated by Square Enix with Deus Ex Human Revolution the year before. Ubisoft's Far Cry managed to be simultaneously more successful than its predecessor and a bit worse in most aspects apart from it actually having characters in it. Also had a plot that was supposed to be clever, subversive, and such, and a writer that was a bit angry that no one agreed that it was clever or subversive and such. Mass Effect ran into a similar problem with its third outing. What was supposed to be the end of the trilogy turned into an attempt to fix a rushed, lame, and yet convoluted conclusion that made even less sense the more you thought about it compared to the rest of the series. Even with the patches they tried to change it for the better. After finishing the fight, Microsoft's Halo 4 started a new fight. This joke brought to you by Loading Ready Run. PlanetSide 2 took the concept of large-scale first-person shooting warfare and turned it up to 11, then turned the graphics down to 9 because nobody could run them at 10. Crusader Kings 2 managed to turn the concept of medieval diplomacy from something that may have seemed a bit boring and awfully niche into a hugely successful game that is still getting content 6 years later because people are still buying it, even though it has full mod support so anybody can make anything for it. The DLCs are still selling. It was the kind of low-budget, high-earning success that could really push a small studio to new heights, and it did. Paradox growing considerably thanks to Crusader Kings 2, but not big enough to go mad and start doing crazy things. For example, crazy things like have Peter Molyneux promise to everyone at E3 that Fable the Journey wasn't on rails, and even had journalists sign a wall agreeing that it wasn't on rails. Now, this happened in 2011, at that year's E3, and when the game came out in 2012, surprise, it was on rails. And the media wonders why people have trust issues. Well, that and the Doritos Pope incident, where noted gaming journalist and general positive influence Jeff Keighley was taking part in an interview surrounded by product placements, talking about them and in general looking like he had to be there in that context, looking like a total sellout with no hope. And when a man by the name of Rab Florence pointed this out in an article on the website Eurogamer alongside expressing his doubt about the integrity of some members of the gaming press when they coat themselves in marketing materials and take presents that sort of look like bribes from publishers, things got really intense. Within a day of being published, the article would be modified to edit out references to one party mentioned. Eurogamer would be threatened with a lawsuit because of that mention, and Rab Florence would be out of a job. The gaming media at large did not react well. It got mean, like an alcoholic being told that maybe it should stop drinking so much. It hasn't really recovered. It's just increasingly irrelevant, but it did start to latch onto a new narrative because of this incident. We'll get back to it in a few weeks. Other notable games from 2012 were the monster profit earner Candy Crush Saga, evidence that Electronic Arts couldn't port Bejeweled to smartphones quick enough or monetize it in evil enough ways, though it would learn from this mistake quite soon. Then there was the very artistic Journey for the PlayStation 3, a beautiful game with great visuals in a cooperative mode that allowed for no direct communication, a shared experience with a stranger that you would treasure for as long as you wanted to. I should probably also mention that that's when the standalone version of the mod Dear Esther came out, turning what used to be a sketch from the parody show Escapist News Network into a game, and sparking the question of how pretentious can the gaming media be until somebody calls it out on its bullshit. It also posed the question of if a game can still be a game if it doesn't have gameplay. The answer is no, much like a football game can't be a football game without players, goalposts, a ball, and running. You're just standing alone in an empty field. So, what was the game of 2012? Well, it wasn't a game from 2012. A few weeks ago, there was a mention of something called a Kickstarter being founded, a crowdfunding platform that was being used by artists, even by some game developers, to fund small little titles. A lot of them would not succeed, more of them would get ignored even if they did. But this year something changed. This year, Tim Schafer, the creator of some of the funniest adventure games ever conceived, made a heartfelt plea to everyone in the world to help him fund a new adventure game when no one in the industry would. He asked for $400,000 to make the game and a documentary about its creation or about its failure. That's more money than any gaming project had ever asked on Kickstarter. And by the history of such efforts, it was bound to fail. And yet, in less than a day, it had surpassed that number twice over. The outpouring of compassion and support from the gaming community was unprecedented. Double Fine's idea, which didn't even have a name, let alone a concrete concept behind it, earned the studio over $3 million, minus taxes and fees, in money that would never need to be paid back. Complete financing for a new game without the involvement of a publisher, without interference, without being told that such a game is unmarketable, unpopular, unsellable to today's crowd. Paired with Steam's new Greenlight program that allowed any game to be sold on the service as long as the community voted for it, it meant the end of the hold that publishers had on the industry, that financiers had on the industry. Anyone that would make a game could make a game. Much like Arthur said in the great movie Excalibur, anyone who would be a knight, follow a king, follow me. The tools that existed, the financing methods, the distribution, they were all here to change the gaming world. And so because of Double Fine Adventure's success, that year games you'd think would never get made received financing. And not just games, everything, anything. Elite Dangerous, Wasteland 2, War for the Overworld, Star Citizen, Shadowrun Returns, Dead State, Carmageddon Reincarnation, Xenonauts, The Banner Saga, Chivalry, Medieval Warfare, Planetary Annihilation, Pillars of Eternity, the Oculus Rift VR headset, and those are just a few of the ones that I can remember that were funded that year. None of them would have existed without Tim Schafer telling people that he really wanted to make an adventure game again, and can he please have some money to do it. And that is why Double Fine Adventure is the game of 2012. Sure, the unresolved Broken Age may not have lived up to the expectations, but that's the point. Kickstarter gave us hope. It gave people control again over a games industry that was increasingly stale, and that control meant also the freedom to fail, the freedom to try, the freedom to succeed. And a lot of what got funded didn't turn out the way we wanted to, but at least an attempt was made. And sure, some of the things that did get funded were horrible ideas from the get-go, like the Ouya console, anything involving giving Peter Molyneux money, or that one thing that monetized outrage and slacktivism culture in order to make people ashamed of their own hobbies. But for the most part, Kickstarter and the Double Fine adventure were a force for good, even if some projects that were worth funding didn't get the attention they needed, the attention they deserved. And with that, we end 2012. No Mayan apocalypse, no end of the world. It's almost like the people peddling this stuff with exact dates and vague supernatural evidence are lying. Next week, the AAA market eats itself alive. Goodbye.